Welcome to this chapter by chapter reading of the Montessori Method by Dr. Maria Montessori. When I was starting my Montessori school, I turned directly to Dr. Montessori's original writings, partly out of conviction and partly because they were available in the public domain and free. What I didn't realize at the time was I was reading the original English translation commissioned while Dr. Montessori was still alive, translated in 1912 by Anne E. George. Later, I discovered that many of us have encountered Montessori through later translations, especially the 1967 version, which helped spread the method widely in the US, and for which I'm personally grateful. But returning to the original text, I found something more: Dr. Montessori's full voice, her depth, her vision, and her spiritual and philosophical foundations. In this podcast, I'm reading the original translation chapter by chapter, adding reflections to help connect her words to today's classrooms and families. This is an experiment, an adventure, and a shared journey of learning. Let's begin. Hi and welcome. My name is Melissa Rohan, and I am the founder and head of school here at Waterfront Academy. We have been doing chapter by chapter reading of Dr. Montessori's The Montessori Method. This is the first translation in 1912 by Anne E. George, and we have been doing this chapter by chapter. So this time we are doing chapter 18. I was doing this every day, and then school started, and so now here I'm on the weekend doing it, and it's like I forgot everything that I was doing every day over Christmas vacation. Anyways, so here we are. We're going to read chapter by chapter, Language in Childhood, chapter 18. So this chapter is very interesting. So as we discovered in chapter 17, and earlier we were looking at how she came up with the reading and writing, and why she came up with the reading and writing for the primary age children, ages 3 through 6, and how remarkable it was, how it was just something that was institutionally not done at all. And so she made these huge changes in expectations for children of this age group. So now we're at the point where she needs to then figure out, well, why does it work, right? Like, why is this working? And that's what this chapter is. It is talking about, hey, this really great thing that I created because of all of these different things. The children wanted it. The parents wanted it. We tried it. It worked. Not only did it worked remarkably, and it worked better than the older children in elementary school. And, okay, why? Why does this work? And that's what she really explores in here. This is the science that she discovers through her observations of her method. So, a couple of things. I think that she really discovers that, or she identifies that this age is a sensitive period for language. Now, in being a human, we are humans. Communicating is really important to being human. And so it's almost natural for humans to talk to each other, right? It's almost developmental. Now, reading and writing, not so much. It's a very deliberate preparation and process. And so, again, Montessori identifies early childhood as a sensitive period for language acquisition, and so your brain is likely to receive sound, structure, and meaning. It's uniquely receptive to that, and which is why if you can teach a child a second or third language before the age of 6, their brains are just so receptive to it, right? So it doesn't even have to just be in one language. It can be multiple. And we discuss that a lot here at Waterfront Academy with parents and teachers. I have a book now that's coming out on that. So yeah, it's a very big part here that we talk about. And then she also talks about the perfect enunciation and why that's important, and how adults should model it, and how children are receiving it and mimicking it and learning it. And she really talks about how The children are imitating. So when we're teaching children how to speak and language, we need to be perfect enunciators so that they can be as well. And because they're imitating us. So we can't really correct them. We just model how it's supposed to go, right? So slurred speech, baby talk, careless pronunciation, doesn't help them in the long run. And in fact, it interferes with that reading and writing later. So we need to be very, very deliberate in our enunciation and providing perfect enunciation and slow, clear, precise. And she talks about, fewer words are better many times in discipline as well, right? Fewer words. She talks about how language comes before writing. Oral language is foundational. She talks about phonetic awareness, the role of the hand in language development. Language is built indirectly, not forced. So there's a lot in here, and it's actually not a terribly long chapter, but she covers a lot. So let's go ahead and get started on chapter 18, Language in Childhood. Graphic language, comprising dictation and reading, contains articulate language in its complete mechanism: auditory channels, central channels, motor channels, and in the manner of development called forth by my method, is based essentially on articulate language. Graphic language, therefore, may be considered from 2 points of view. A, that the conquest of a new language of eminent social importance, which adds itself into the articulate language of natural man. And this is the cultural significance which is commonly given to graphic language, which is therefore taught in the schools without any consideration of its relation to spoken language, but solely with the intention of offering to the social being a necessary instrument in his relations with his fellows. B, that the relation between graphic and articulate language, and in this relation of an eventual possibility of utilizing the language or the written language to perfect the spoken. A new consideration upon which I wish to insist and which gives to graphic language a sociological importance. Moreover, as spoken language is at the same time a natural function of man and an instrument which he utilizes for social ends, so written language may be considered in itself, in its formation, as an organic ensemble of new mechanisms which are established in the nervous system, and as an instrument which may be utilized for social ends. In short, it is a question of giving to written language not only a sociological importance, but also a period of development independent of the high functions which it is destined to perform later. It seems to me that graphic language bristles with difficulties in its beginnings, not only because it has heretofore been taught by irrational methods, but because we have tried to make it perform as soon as it has been acquired the high function of teaching the written language, which has been fixed by centuries of perfecting in a civilized people. Think how irrational have been the methods we have used. We have analyzed the graphic signs rather than the sociological acts necessary to produce the alphabetical signs, and this without considering that any graphic sign is difficult to achieve because the visual representation of the signs have no hereditary connection with the motor representations necessary for producing them, as, for example, the auditory representations of the word have with the motor mechanism of the articulate language. It is, therefore, always a difficult thing to provoke a stimulative motor action unless we have already established the movement before the visual representation of the sign is made. It is a difficult thing to arouse an activity that shall produce a motion unless that motion shall have been previously established by practice and by the power of habit. Thus, for example, the analysis of writing into little straight lines and curves has brought us to present to the child a sign without significance, which therefore does not interest him, and whose representation is incapable of determining a spontaneous motor impulse. The artificial act constituted, therefore, an effort of the will which resulted for the child in rapid exhaustion, exhibited in the form of boredom and suffering. To this effort was added the effort of constituting synchronously the muscular association coordinating the movements necessary to the holding and manipulating the instrument of writing. All sorts of depressing feelings accompanied such efforts and conduced to the production of imperfect and erroneous signs, which the teachers had to correct, discouraging the child still more with the constant criticism of the error and of the imperfection of the signs traced. Thus, while the child was urged to make an effort, the teacher depressed rather than revived the physical forces. Although such a mistaken course was followed, the graphic language so painfully learned was nevertheless to be immediately utilized for social ends, and still imperfect and immature, was made to do service in the syntactical construction of the language. And in the ideal expression of the superior psychic centers, one must remember that in nature the spoken language is formed gradually, and it is already established in words when the superior psychic centers use these words in what Small direct calls dictorium, in the syntactical, grammatical formation of language, which is necessary to the expression of complex ideas, that is, in the language of the logical mind. In short, the mechanism of language is a necessary antecedent of the higher psychic activities which are to utilize it. There are, therefore, two periods in the development of language: a lower one which prepares the nervous channel and the central mechanisms which are to put the sensory channels in relation with the motor channels, and a higher one determined by the higher psychic activities which are exteriorized by means of the performing mechanisms of language. Thus, for example, in the scheme which Kusamal gives to the mechanism of articulate language, we must first of all distinguish a sort of cerebral diastolic arc representing the pure mechanism of the word, which is established in the first formation of the spoken language. So here is the diagram. You see it there? So let E be the ear and T the motor organs of speech, taken as the whole and here represent by the tongue. A, the auditory center of the speech, and M, the motor center. The channels E, A, and F, T are peripheral channels, the former centripetal and latter centrifugal, and the channel A is the intercentral channel of association. The center A, in which resides the auditive images of words, again subdivided into three, as in the following scheme. Okay, so here it is there. Okay. Sound, SO, symbols, SY, and words, U. That particular center for sounds and syllables can really be formed. The pathology of language seems to establish for in some form of centrosensory dysphagia, and the patients can pronounce only sounds or at most sounds and syllables. Small children, too, are at the beginning particularly sensitive to simple sounds of language, with which indeed, and especially with us. Their mothers caress them and attract their attention, while later the child is sensitive to syllables with which the mother caresses him, saying ba, ba, puff, tuff. Finally, it is the simple word dissyllabic in most children, or in most cases, which attract the child's attention. But for the motor centers, also the same thing may be repeated. The child utters at the beginning simple or double sounds, as for example, bl, gl, ch, an expression which the mother greets with joy. Then distinctly symbolic sounds beginning to manifest themselves in the child. G, B. And finally, the dissyllabic word, usually labial mama. We say that the spoken language begins with the child when the word produced by him signifies an idea. When, for example, seeing his mother and recognizing her, he says mama, and seeing a dog says tete, and wishing to eat says papa. Thus, we consider language begun when it is established in relation to perception, while the language itself is still, in its psychomotor mechanism, perfectly rudimentary. That is, when above the diastolic arc, where the mechanical formation of the language is still unconscious, the recognition of the word takes place. That is, the word is perceived and associated with the object which it represents. Language is considered to have begun. On this level, later, language continues the process of perfecting in proportion, as the hearing perceives better the compound sounds of the word and the psychomotor channels become more permeable to articulation. This is the first stage of spoken language, which has its own beginning and its own development, leading through the perceptions to the perfecting of the primordial mechanism of the language itself. And at this stage precisely is established what is called articulate language, which will later be the means which the adult will have at his disposal to express his own thoughts, and which the adult will have great difficulty in perfecting or correcting when it has once been established. In fact, a high stage of cultural sometimes accompanies an imperfect articulate language which prevents the aesthetic expression of one's thought. The development of articulate language takes place in the period between the age of 2 and the age of 7. The age of perceptions, in which the attention of the child is spontaneously turned toward external objects and the memory is particularly tenacious. Also of motility, in which all the psychomotor channels are becoming permeable and the muscular mechanisms establish themselves. In this period of life, by the mysterious bond between the auditory channels and the motor channel of the spoken language, it would seem that the auditory perceptions have the direct power of provoking the complicated movements of articulate speech, which develop instinctively after such stimuli as if awakening from the slumber of heredity. It is well known that it is only at this age that it is possible to acquire all the characteristic modulations of a language which it would be in vain to attempt to establish later. The mother tongue alone is well pronounced because it was established in the period of childhood, and the adult who learns to speak a new language must bring to it the imperfections characteristic of the foreigner's speech. Only children who under the age of 7 years learn several languages at the same time can reseed and reproduce all the characteristic mannerisms of accent and pronunciation. Thus, also the defects required in childhood, such as dialect defects or those established by bad habits, become indelible in the adult. What develops later, the superior language, the dictorum, no longer has its origin in the mechanism of language, but in the intellectual development which makes use of the mechanical language. As the articulate language develops by the exercise of its mechanism and is enriched by perception, the dictorum develops with syntax and is enriched by intellectual culture. Going back to the scheme of language, we see that above the arc which defines the lower language is established the dictorum, D, from which now come the motor impulses of speech, which is established as spoken language fit to manifest the ideation of the intelligent man. This language will be enriched little by intellectual culture and perfected by the grammatical study of syntax. Hitherto, as a result of preconception, it has been believed that written language should enter only into the development of the dictorium as a suitable means for acquisition of culture and of permitting grammatical analysis and construction of the language. Since spoken words have wings, it has been admitted that intellectual culture could only proceed by the aid of a language which was stable, objective, and capable of being analyzed, such as the graphic language. But why When we acknowledge the graphic language as a precious, indispensable instrument of intellectual education, for the reason that it fixes the idea of men and permits it of their analysis and of their assimilation in books, where they may remain indelibly written as an ineffaceable memory of words which are therefore always present and by which we can analyze the syntactical structure of the language. Why shall we not acknowledge that it is useful in the more humble task of fixing the words which represent perception of and of analyzing their component sounds? Compelled by a pedagogical prejudice, we are unable to separate the idea of a graphic language from that of a function where heretofore we have made it exclusively perform, and to seem to us that by teaching such a language to children still in the age of simple perceptions and of motility, we are committing a serious psychological and pedagogical error. But let us rid ourselves of this prejudice and consider the graphic language in itself, reconstructing its sociological mechanism. It is far more simple than the psychological mechanism of the articulate language, and is far more directly accessible to education. Writing, especially, is surprisingly simple. For let us consider didactic writing. We have a perfect parallel with spoken language, since a motor action must correspond with heard speech. Here, there does not exist, to be sure, the mysterious hereditary relations between the heard speech and the articulate speech. But the movements of writing are far simpler than those necessary to the spoken word, and are performed by large muscles, all external, upon which we can directly act, rendering the motor channels permeable and establishing psychomuscular mechanisms. This indeed is what is done by my method, which prepares the movements directly so that the psychomotor impulse of the heard speech finds the motor channels already established and is manifested in the act of writing, like an explosion. The real difficulty is in the interpretation of the graphic signs, but we must remember that we are in the age of perceptions, where the sensations and the memory, as well as the primitive associations, are involved precisely in the characteristic progress of natural development. Moreover, our children are already prepared by various exercises of the senses and by methodological construction of ideas and mental associations to perceive the sound s. This is obvious experience which shows that in reality children proceed without effort, nay, rather with evident manifestations of pleasure, to the recognition of graphic signs presented as objects. And with this premise, let us consider the relation between the mechanisms of the two languages. The child of 3 or 4 has already long begun his articulate language according to our scheme, but he finds himself in the period in which the mechanism of articulate language is being perfected, a period contemporary with that in which he is acquiring a content of language along with the patrimony of perception. The child has perhaps not heard perfectly in all their component parts the words which he pronounces, and if he has heard them perfectly, they may have been pronounced badly, and consequently have left an erroneous auditory perception. It would be well that the child by exercising the motor channels of articulate language should establish exactly the movements necessary to a perfect articulation before the age of easy motor adaptations is past, and by the fixation of erroneous mechanisms, the defects become incorrigible. To this end, the analysis of speech is necessary, as when we wish to perfect the language, we first start children at composition and then pass to grammatical study. And when we wish to perfect the style, we first teach to write grammatically and then come to the analysis of style. So when we wish to perfect the speech, it is first necessary that the speech exist, and then it is proper to proceed to its analysis. When therefore the child speaks, but before the completion of the development of speech, which renders it fixed in mechanisms already established, the speech should be analyzed with a view to perfecting it. Now, as grammar and rhetoric are not possible with the spoken language, but demand recourse to the written language, which keeps ever before the child, the eye, the discourse to be analyzed, so it is with speech. The analysis of the transient is impossible. The language must be materialized and made stable. Hence the necessity of the written word or the word represented by graphic signs. In the third stage of my method for writing, that is composition of speech, is included the analysis of the word not only into signs, but into the component sounds, the signs representing its translation. The child, that is, divides the heard word, which he perceives perceives integrally as a word, knowing also its meaning, into sounds and syllables. Let me call attention to the following diagram, which represents the interrelation of the two mechanisms for writing and for articulate speech. Whereas in the development of spoken language, the sound composing the word might be imperfectly perceived. Here, in the teaching of the graphic sign corresponding to the sound, which teaching consists in presenting to the child a sandpaper letter, naming it distinctly, and making the child see it and touch it, not only is the perception of the heard sound clearly fixed, separately and clearly, but this perception is associated with two others, the centromotor perception and the centrovisual perception of the written sign. Let me go back to these diagrams here, this one here, and this one down here. And this one down here, it says the peripheral channels are indicated by heavy lines. The central channels are of association by dotted lines, and those referring to the association in relation to the development of the heard speech by light lines. E, ear, so auditory center of sounds. Y, auditory center of syllables. U, auditory center of word. Motor center of the articulate speech. T, external organs of articulate speech, tongue. H, external organs of writing. MC, motor center of writing. VC, visual center of graphic signs. And V, organ of vision. Okay, here it is again. The triangle VCMCSO represents the association of three sensations in relation with the analysis of speech. When the letter is presented to the child and he is made to touch it and see it while it is being named, the centrifugal channels ESO, MCSO, VCSO are acting, and when the child is made to name the letter alone or accompanied by a vowel, the external stimulus acts in V and passes through the channels V, V, C, S, O, M, T, and V, C, V, S, O, S, Y, M, T. When these channels of associations have been established by presenting visual stimuli in the graphic signs, the corresponding movements of articulate language can be provoked and studied one by one in their defects, while by maintaining the visual stimulus of the graphic sign which provokes articulation and accompanying it by the auditory stimulus of the corresponding sound uttered by the teacher, their articulation can be perfected. This articulation is by innate conditions connected with the heard speech, that is, in the course of the pronunciation provoked by the visual stimulus, and during the repetition of the relative movements of the organs of language. The auditory stimulus, which is introduced into the exercise, contributes to the perfecting of the pronunciation of the isolation or syllabic sound composing the spoken word. When later the child writes under dictation, translating into signs the sounds of speech, he analyzes the heard speech into its sounds, translating them into graphic movements through channels already rendered permeable by the corresponding muscular sensations. Defects of language due to lack of education. Defects and imperfections of language are in part due to organic causes, consisting in malformations or in pathological alterations of the nervous system, but in part they are connected with functional defects acquired in the period of the formation of language and consist in erratic pronunciation of the component sounds of the spoken word. Such errors are acquired by the child who hears words imperfectly pronounced or hears bad speech. The dialect accent enters into this category, but there also enter vicious habits which make the natural defects of the articulate language of childhood persist in the child, or which provoke him by imitation the defects of language particular to the persons who surrounded him in his childhood. The normal defects of child language are due to the fact that the complicated muscular agencies of the organs of articulate language do not yet function well and are consequently incapable of reproducing the sound which was the sensory stimulus of a certain innate movement. The association of the movements necessary to the articulate language of the spoken words is established little by little. The result is a language made of words with sounds which are imperfect and often lacking, hence incomplete words. Such defects are grouped under the name blowstats and are especially due to the fact that the child is not yet capable of directing the movement of his tongue. They comprise chiefly stigmatism or imperfect pronunciation of S, rhotacism or imperfect pronunciation of R, amdecism or imperfect pronunciation of L, gammacism or imperfect pronunciation of G, iotism, defect pronunciation of the gutturals, moglalia, perfect pronunciation of the labials. And according to some authors, as prayer, magillolia are made to include also the suppression of the first sound of a word. Some defects of pronunciation which concern the utterance of the vowel sound as well as that of the consonant are due to the fact that the child reproduces perfectly sounds imperfectly heard. In the first case, then, it is a matter of functional insufficiencies in the peripheral motor organ and hence of the nervous channel, and the cause lies in the individual, whereas in the second case, the error is caused by the auditory stimulus and the cause lies outside. These defects often persist, however attenuated, in the boy and the child, and produce finally in erroneous language to which will later be added in writing orthographical errors, such example in dialect orthographical errors. If one considers the charm of human speech, one is bound to acknowledge the inferiority of one who does not possess a correct spoken language, and an aesthetic conception in education cannot be imagined unless special care be devoted to perfecting articulate language. Although the Greeks had transmitted to Rome the art of educating in language, this practice was not resumed by humanism, which cared more for the aesthetic of the environment and the revival of artistic works than for the perfecting of the man. Today, we are just beginning to introduce the practice of correcting by pedagogical methods the serious defects of language, such as stammering. But the idea of linguistic gymnastics tending to its perfection has not yet penetrated into our schools as a universal method. And as a detail of the great work of the aesthetic perfecting of man, some teachers of deaf mutes and intelligent devotees of orthophony are trying nowadays with small practical success to introduce into the elementary schools the correction of the various forms of blowstats. As a result of the statistical studies which have demonstrated the wide diffusion of such defects among the pupils, the exercises consist essentially in silence cures, which procure calm and repose for the organs of language, and in patient repetition of the separate vowels and consonant sounds. To these exercises is added also respiratory gymnastics. This is not the place to describe in detail the methods of these exercises, which are long and patient and quite out of harmony with the teachings of the school. But in my methods are to be found all exercises for the correction of language, exercises of silence, which prepare the nervous channel of language to receive new stimuli perfectly. B. lessons which consist first in the distinct pronunciation by the teacher of few words, especially of nouns, which must be associated with a concrete idea. By this means, clear and perfect auditory stimuli of language are started, stimuli which are repeated by the teacher when the child has conceived the idea of the object represented by the word, recognition of the object. Finally, of the provocation of articulate language on the part of the child, who must repeat that word alone aloud, pronouncing its separate sounds. C. Exercises in graphic language, which analyze the sound of speech and cause them to be repeated separately in several ways. That is, when the child learns the separate letters of the alphabet and when he composes or writes words, repeating their sounds, which he translates separately into composed or written speech. D. Gymnastics exercises, which comprise, as we have seen, both respiratory exercises and those of articulation. I believe that in the schools of the future, the conception will disappear, which is beginning today, of correcting in the elementary schools the defects of language, and will be replaced by the more rational one of avoiding them by caring for the development of language in the children's house, that is, at the very age in which language is being established in the child. That concludes this chapter of the Montessori Method. Thank you for listening and for taking part in this journey with me. This project is very much an exploration. If you have thoughts to add, questions to ask, or if you think I misunderstood or missed something important, I genuinely want to hear from you. Please message me, share your reflections, or continue the conversation with fellow listeners. On a quest to learning, relearning, and engaging deeply with Dr. Montessori's work as we go. Join me next time as we continue chapter by chapter.